One man's secret recipe became another man's silence. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Drop a quick comment and share your location. It's great connecting with you all. Your support keeps these mysteries alive. Let's unravel it. I've always said that timing is a suspicious thing. A man shows up at your door before 9 in the morning, and odds are he's either in a panic or a uniform. The gent who rang our bell at precisely 8:43 a.m. was neither. He wore a suit too, new for his face and shoes too scuffed for his tie, and while he didn't look panicked, he was sweating bullets. I opened the door with what I hoped was a welcoming expression, which probably landed somewhere between curiosity and caffeine withdrawal. "Goodwin," he said, a little breathlessly. "Archie Goodwin? That's me. You're either here for the orchids, the eggs, or the detective. Pick one." "I need Mr. Wolfe," he said. "Please, I won't take long." I brought sausage. That got my attention, not because I have an unnatural attachment to breakfast meats, I'm more of a steak and eggs man when I can get away with it, but because bringing sausage to Nero Wolfe is the equivalent of tossing your keys to a valet and expecting not to get judged. I stepped aside and let him in. He carried a brown paper sack with grease darkening the bottom and a cautious reverence usually reserved for communion wafers or bomb parts. When we hit the threshold of the front room, Fritz poked his head out. From the kitchen, with the same look he'd give a man wearing muddy galoshes near the stovetop. "Fritz," I said, "we've got a sausage situation." "I see that," Fritz replied, sniffing the air like a sommelier at a truck stop. "And I smell caraway, humph." Our visitor looked suddenly less confident. "It's a family recipe. I just thought—" "You thought wrong," I said cheerfully, guiding him through the hall. "Follow me, just don't expect a standing ovation." When we entered the office, Nero Wolfe was seated in the yellow leather chair that might as well have been carved from the throne of reason itself. He didn't look up. At that hour he was deep in his second breakfast, a poached egg, a toasted muffin, and a glare for anyone who disrupted him before 10. "Mr. Wolfe," I announced, "this is a man with sausage and a problem. I can't speak for the sausage, but the problem looks authentic." Wolfe lifted his eyes just high enough to acknowledge the intrusion, which for him was practically a salute. "Archie, remove that parcel from my office. It offends." I'm sorry," the man stammered, clearly rattled. "I didn't mean to offend. I thought it might help convince you to take the case." Wolfe arched an eyebrow. "A case of what, sausage poisoning?" "No, sir," he said. "My name is Anton Miska. I run Miska's Meats on 10th Avenue. I believe someone is trying to ruin me and possibly kill me." That got Wolfe to blink. A slow, deliberate one. He didn't love being interrupted, but he hated being misled more. "I suppose," Wolfe said, folding his napkin with disdain, "that you intend to elaborate." Anton Miska nodded eagerly, setting the brown bag on the edge of Wolfe's desk like an offering. I nudged it off and onto the credenza before Wolfe set fire to it with his eyes. "I inherited the business from my uncle, who died last year," Miska said. "I make everything by hand. Bratwurst, Kielbasa, merguez. It's niche, but it pays. At least it did until 3 weeks ago. That's when strange things began happening." "You are not the first man," Wolfe said, "to be pursued by sausages." "No, not sausages," Miska corrected. "Customers started getting sick. A little at first, bad stomachs, headaches. I tested everything twice, nothing's wrong with the product. Then last Thursday a health inspector showed up with an anonymous complaint and shut me down." "Anonymous," I said. "That's always convenient." "I can't prove anything," Miska continued, "but someone's sabotaging me. My uncle had rivals, some ugly ones, but he also had secrets." "Of course he did," I muttered. "It wouldn't be fun otherwise." Wolfe sighed, loud and operatic. "This is not a matter for a detective. You require legal counsel or a better cleaning regimen. I've spoken to my lawyer. He says unless I can prove it's deliberate sabotage, the health department won't back down." "I thought You could investigate who's behind it. I'll pay whatever you require. That last part got Wolfe to sit up straighter by a full inch. I don't chase food criminals, Wolfe said, if your sausages are as innocent as you. Claim you'll be exonerated in time. I'm not just talking about business sabotage, Miska said. I think whoever is doing this killed my uncle. Wolfe paused, and his eyes went very still. Go on. My uncle, Eric Miska, died. In his sleep. Heart failure, they said. He was 61 and not exactly the healthiest. But I found something in his ledger. A coded note, something about the cold room and 3 names not to forget. I tried to figure it out, but before I could, someone broke into the shop. Didn't steal a thing, just moved things. Rearranged my spice racks, replaced my padlocks, left me a note in butcher paper. Some secrets should stay buried. That did it. Wolfe turned his head slowly toward me. Archie, if you can endure a morning without tormenting me with speculative fiction, make arrangements. For a trip to 10th Avenue? No. For Mr. Miska to return tomorrow at 11. I will decide then if his sausages and his secrets warrant further interest. Miska looked both relieved and bewildered. You'll help me? I said I will decide, Wolfe corrected. Leave the parcel outside. When he was gone, I dropped the bag on the stoop and dusted off my hands like I'd just removed a corpse. Wolfe leaned back, the tips of his fingers meeting like they always did when he was pretending not to care. Sausages, Archie, he said. Always underestimated until they're not. I nodded. And when they come wrapped with mystery, coded ledgers, and midnight spice rearrangements, I guess they're your kind of meat. Don't be fatuous. Who, me? I grinned. I'm just savoring the case, or at least the appetizer. The next morning, at precisely 11 o'clock, Anton Miska was back in the office. His hands folded tightly in his lap like he was waiting for the verdict in a murder trial, and he might have been, depending on what Wolfe would find buried beneath his talk of coded ledgers and butcher paper warnings. Wolfe didn't greet him. He didn't even glance at him. He sat in his oversized throne behind the desk, eyes half-lidded and fingertips joined, looking like a man expecting confession rather than conversation. I took the client's statement, per usual with my notebook on one knee and one eye on Wolfe for any sudden signs of life. Miska's story, the second time around, didn't get any prettier. My uncle Eric was careful, he said, about recipes, suppliers, deliveries, everything. He had this habit of keeping notes that didn't look like notes, codes, initials. He trusted no one, not even me, yet left the business to you, I pointed out. He had no one else. I was the only blood relative who didn't owe him money or want to punch him, and I worked there since I was 16. Wolfe gave a sound like a reluctant puff of wind. This note, you have it? Miska reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and unfolded a thin yellowing sheet of paper. It looked like it had once been part of a ledger, torn roughly from the binding. Scrawled on it, in tight, nervous handwriting, was Cold Room. 3 names, not to forget SR par DT of JM. Sausages speak, watch what they say. He handed it to me and I took it over to Wolfe, who accepted it between 2 fingers like I'd passed him a used handkerchief. He scanned it once, then closed his eyes. You believe this connects to your uncle's death? I do. Something about that note scared him. A week before he died, he was jumpier than I'd ever seen him, and the night he passed, I remember because I was the one who locked up the shop. He said to me, if anything happens, you mind that room. By which, Wolfe said, you assume he meant the cold room. He had a walk-in refrigerator in the back of the shop, locked, always locked. Even I didn't have a key until after he died. Did you examine it? Of course. I found nothing unusual, just the meat inventory. But then the break-in happened. Someone tampered with that lock. Not forced it, but replaced it. And rearranged everything inside. That's what got to me. It's not just about making me look incompetent. Someone's hiding something. Wolfe took a deep breath. which in his case was akin to a standing ovation. "You said you were shut down." "Yes." "The health department came in with a tip and found a trace of listeria in one of the prep trays, but I clean obsessively. That tray had already been sterilized the night before. I think someone planted it. Have you any idea who might benefit from your ruin?" Miska didn't hesitate. "There are 3, maybe 4 other artisanal sausage shops in Manhattan that see me as competition. But if I had to pick one, I'd say Salvador Rojas. He runs La Riqueza, a trendy Latin charcuterie spot down in the West Village. We had words last year. My uncle accused him of stealing a recipe." Wolfe raised an eyebrow, which meant I was cleared to speak. "Sounds like a good place to start," I said. "Him and the 2 others on that list. DT could be Dominic. Trento. He runs a supplier warehouse in the Bronx. Used to deliver our dry spices and pork trimmings, but he suddenly cut us off last month. No explanation." "And JM?" Miska hesitated. "That one might be Jane Morrissey. She's an attorney. Used to handle my uncle's business contracts, but they had a falling out. She accused him of misrepresenting income." "I see," Wolfe murmured, setting the note aside. "Mr. Goodwin." I was already getting to my feet. "I know. West Village first." "Discreetly," Wolfe added. "No declarations, no confrontation. Observe and report, see what sausages say." Miska blinked. "You believe me?" "I believe that sausages, as you put it, speak," Wolfe said, "and often for those who wish to remain silent." I showed Miska out and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. He was still wrung tight as butcher's twine. "We'll sniff something out," I told him. "Don't go grinding your own worries into links just yet." On the sidewalk, I flagged a cab and headed to La Riqueza, a boutique storefront with dark wood paneling, gold lettering on the window, and music playing so softly it sounded like a flirtation. The place smelled good, I'll give them that. Chorizo. And rosemary, plus something smoky and unfamiliar. Behind the glass counter stood Salvador Rojas, mid-40s, fit, shirt too tight, and smile too wide. He was slicing dry-cured lomo with the practiced ease of a man who knew both his product and his charm. "Archie Goodwin," I said, handing over one of our cards. "I'm not here for sausage, I'm here about Eric Miska." The name didn't ruffle him, but the pause between slices got a little longer. "He's dead," Rojas said. "He is. His nephew thinks it wasn't entirely natural." Rojas shrugged. "Heart trouble, wasn't it? The man lived off bratwurst and spite. He also left a coded note with 3 sets of initials. Yours was one." "Really?" Rojas smiled. "Then I feel flattered. I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying. I didn't even like the man. Tell me about this recipe theft business." "That's old noise. He accused me of stealing a paprika blend. I said his memory was failing and we left it there. I don't sabotage people, Mr. Goodwin. I don't need to." I looked around. There were customers browsing artisan mustards, hand-smoked almonds. "Someone's trying to shut Miska's meats down," I said. "Health complaints, break-ins, you wouldn't know anything about that." "I wouldn't," he said smoothly. "But if I were you, I'd ask someone who lost something when Miska took over. Like anyone who owed Eric money, or anyone whose name ended up in his ledger. He had records going back decades. That was a tip, intentional or not." And I didn't miss the way Rojas's eyes narrowed when he said ledger. I gave him a nod and turned toward the door. "Oh, Mr. Goodwin?" "Yeah?" "I suggest you tell Mr. Wolfe not to stick his nose too deep in sausage casings. Sometimes they snap." That was colorful. I jotted it down in my head as I got in the cab and dialed the brownstone. Wolfe answered on the second ring, which for him was essentially sprinting to the phone. He didn't flinch, I told him. "But he's hiding something. He knows about the ledger and he's not fond of the Miskas." "Then observe protocol," Wolfe said. "We will see what the other names have to say." I leaned back in the seat, already turning over the next move. A supplier who suddenly dropped a client, an ex-attorney with a grudge, a note scribbled in a dead man's ledger warning that sausages speak, and someone somewhere rearranging spice jars like they were writing a message in cumin and sage. Whatever. It wasn't just about sausage. It was about secrets, ones that were about to spoil. I caught Dominic Trento just as he was finishing a heated phone call in his cluttered office above a spice warehouse in the Bronx. He was a stocky guy, in a cable-knit sweater, with a neck like a bulldog's and a permanent scowl he probably inherited from his grandfather, along with the business. Shelves behind him held enough smoked paprika and dried fennel to marinate the state of New Jersey. He looked up at me like I was the second tax audit of the morning. "You from the IRS?" "Nope." "Worse," I said. "Private detective, Archie." "Goodwin, I'm working with Nero Wolfe." That didn't smooth his expression any. If anything, it added a little suspicion to the scowl. "What's Wolfe want with me? I'm clean." I handed over a card and sat down without being asked. "We're looking into some irregularities around Miska's meats. The late Eric. Miska left a few names behind before he died. Yours was one of them." That earned me a grunt. Not a guilty one, more like the kind that says, "Of course I'm on someone's list. I do business. I cut him off last month," Trento said. "That's no crime. I had my reasons." "Mind sharing them?" He started getting cagey about payment, started ordering in smaller batches, but always with last-minute changes. A spice mix one day, pure salt the next. Then he came in here, screaming about bad clove in a shipment I never even sent. Sounds unstable. Or paranoid. Either way, not good for my rep. My warehouse runs on consistency. If a guy can't keep his orders straight, he doesn't get service. I nodded. "Did he ever mention a cold room or make odd references to watching what sausages say?" That got a flicker. Not alarm, more like recognition he didn't. "Want me to notice?" "He was always muttering about the old deals," Trento said. "Said too many hands were stirring the pot. Honestly, I figured he was losing his grip. But now he's dead, and his nephew's crying sabotage. That it?" "You." "Didn't hear it from me," I said, "but someone planted a tainted tray in his shop to get it shut down." "I didn't do that." "Never said you did. But I'm telling you, if someone did, it wasn't about sausages. Miska was holding on to something. Something old. My guess? Whatever it was, it died with him. That would have made things easier, sure, but we weren't that lucky. By the time I left Trento's, the wind had picked up, and the city smelled like someone had spilled pepper oil in a subway vent. I caught a cab and made a quick detour before heading back to the brownstone. There was one name left on the list, Jane Morrissey, and I didn't want to show up at Wolfe's doorstep until I had something conclusive to offer, or at least a fresh contradiction to hang a theory on. Morrissey's office was in a slim, glass-paneled building near Columbus Circle. Legal aid, small-time contracts, the kind of lawyer you call when a family business starts to look like a liability. I showed the receptionist my license and got waved in after a 10-minute wait, filled with aggressive ferns and motivational posters. Jane Morrissey was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, wearing a burgundy suit that matched her lipstick, and said she was used to being the smartest person in most rooms. She didn't look surprised to see me, which is a look I've learned to be suspicious of. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, offering her hand. "You're early. I'm also charming and stubborn, but we can get to that later." She smiled like someone who didn't entirely disagree. "Let me guess, you're here about Eric. I'm here about a note Eric left behind. Your initials were on it, along with 2 others. He seemed to think you were worth remembering." "That sounds like Eric. Paranoid to the end. Look, I used to handle his contracts, leases, vendor disputes, payroll filings. Nothing dramatic, until he decided I was part of some conspiracy to bankrupt him." "Was he wrong?" "Of course, he was wrong," she said, sitting forward. "The man hid money, not always well. I found discrepancies, flagged them, and asked for clarification. He responded by calling me a snake and firing me. Any idea what the discrepancies were about? He hesitated, just long enough for me to catch it. I can't say for certain, but there were cash withdrawals, large ones, that didn't correspond to inventory or payroll. I asked if he was paying off old debts. He said it was none of my business. Maybe it wasn't, but it didn't look like supplier payments. Did it look like hush money? She didn't answer that. Instead, she reached into her desk and pulled out a thin, flat folder. I kept this in case someone came asking, she said, because I had a feeling his books weren't just sloppy. They were layered. There were notes that referenced years. I'd never seen clients that didn't exist. I think he kept two sets of records, the real ones and the ones he showed me. I opened the folder and skimmed the copy she'd made. The paper smelled like toner and old secrets. There were line items marked with only codes. CR7, D5X, and SJ Private, recurring every third month for 2 years. He was laundering money, I said. Or hiding it, she replied. But hiding it from who? That's the real question. I left Morrissey's office with the folder tucked under my arm and my mind racing with a dozen half-formed theories. Back in the cab, I called Fritz and told him to hold dinner. I didn't want to walk into Wolfe's office still chewing pork, loin while he dismantled me for poor syntax. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was where I'd left him, stationary, centered, and mildly disdainful of the outside world. I laid out everything. Rojas's veiled threats, Trento's warning about old deals, and Morrissey's confession that Eric was keeping secret ledgers and laundering cash. Wolfe didn't interrupt once, which meant either he was impressed or he was planning to destroy my logic in a single sentence. When I finished, he asked only one question. "Did you retrieve a sample from the cold room?" "Nope." "Not yet." "Then go back tomorrow," Wolfe said. "With gloves. Bring a portion of each sausage batch still sealed. Planning to taste test?" "Planning to examine. Taste is irrelevant. What matters is variance. If one batch differs from another, then either the recipe was altered or the meat. And if the meat's been tampered with, then we no longer have sabotage. We have a concealed crime." I sat back, whistling low. "You think the cold room's hiding more than bratwurst?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that Anton Miska inherited more than a shop, and whatever his uncle was protecting, someone wants it silenced. Permanently." I looked at the note again, still resting on Wolfe's desk. 3 names. Sausages speak. And, just like that, the room seemed a little colder. The next morning I left the house early enough to make Fritz grumble and Wolfe issue a martyred sigh at my absence from the breakfast table. I skipped eggs, shaved, and headed straight to 10th Avenue. Anton Miska had agreed to meet me at the shop to let me back into the cold room. He sounded both eager and uneasy over the phone, which, if you ask me, is the correct cocktail of emotions when you suspect your late uncle may have been smuggling more than just fennel and nutmeg. The front of Miska's Meats was still shuttered, the iron grate halfway down, like the place was trying to decide whether to stay closed forever or just for the weekend. Anton met me at the side door. He looked tired, creased around the eyes and wearing the same clothes as yesterday, unless he had an affection for grey wool vests that was bordering on pathological. "Thanks for coming," he said, unlocking the door. I didn't want to be in there alone again. "Is it haunted?" I asked, stepping inside. "Because if it is, I charge double for exorcisms." "It's not haunted," he said, but he didn't sound completely sure. "But the cold room, there's something wrong about it." We passed through the main shop. Display cases empty, counters wiped, shelves cleaned with the kind of dedication that either meant deep guilt or deep nerves. The cold room was at the back, behind a heavy insulated steel door. Anton produced a large brass key and handed it to me. "This is the new lock. After the break-in, I had it changed." I nodded and slid the key into the lock. The door clicked, open with a hiss of pressure. The cold hit immediately, dry, clean and sharp. The interior was pristine, tiled, lit by a single overhead bulb. Racks of cured and uncured sausage hung from hooks like little meaty pendulums. Everything was labelled, wrapped, tagged by date and batch. On the far wall, a shelf held sealed containers, clear plastic tubs filled with casings, spice packets and cuts of meat. "I haven't touched anything since I saw the new padlock," Anton said. "I was afraid of contaminating more evidence." Good. Instinct. I pulled on gloves, took out my phone and started photographing the shelf from every angle. Then I opened each container one by one, lifting the corner of each seal. No foul odors, no discoloration, just pork, fat, and a few strands of rosemary. But something was off. I bent closer to one of the tubs labeled Batch 11C. The pork inside looked normal enough, but nestled near the bottom, tucked into the corner. Under a layer of shrink wrap was a small glass vial. I snapped on a second glove. "Don't touch that," I said, holding up a hand as Anton leaned forward. "Stay where you are." I used a plastic spatula to slide the vial out. It was thin, medical grade, sealed with a rubber stopper. Inside was a trace amount of clear liquid. Anton's face went pale. "What the hell is that?" "That," I said, "is a question for Mr. Wolfe." I packed the vial in a container I'd brought along. Call me cautious, but I've learned that anything unusual in meat storage usually requires scientific backup. Then I collected sealed samples from 3 different sausage batches and a pair of spice packets from the shelf. "Did your uncle ever use preservatives or additives that weren't listed?" "No, never. He hated that stuff. We did everything old school, salt, time and temperature. Then someone else brought this in." Anton looked around the cold room like he was seeing it for the first time. "I thought maybe it was just sabotage," he said quietly. "I didn't think it went this far, I didn't either." But the evidence was starting to form a pattern. Someone had used Miska's shop, not just to ruin his name, but to store something they didn't want found. And now, with Erich dead and Anton targeted, the question was shifting from who wants to ruin Miska's meats to what exactly were they using it for. Back at the brownstone, I placed the vial on Wolfe's desk like a sacrifice at an altar. He did not immediately react, which told me 2 things. 1, he'd been expecting something of this nature, and 2, he was already 3 steps deeper into the theory than I was. "Batch 11C, I said. "Hidden at the bottom of a pork tub. The meat looked fine, but this," I gestured at the vial, "was wrapped in plastic, tucked beneath the surface." Wolfe leaned forward, took a long look, then rang the bell for Fritz. When Fritz appeared, Wolfe gave him instructions to prepare the lab setup in the kitchen. "We don't keep a full forensics lab on site. This isn't Scotland Yard, but Wolfe does have a few essentials: a microscope, a chemical kit, and a small selection of testing reagents that Fritz handles with more care than he does soufflés." While Wolfe and Fritz tested the sample in the kitchen, I reviewed Morrissey's ledgers again. I didn't get far before Wolfe summoned me back in. "It's not a preservative," he said, indicating the vial. "It's a sedative, low-dose barbiturate, possibly phenobarbital. Odorless, tasteless in small amounts, the kind used to subdue animals or people." I blinked. "You think someone was drugging the meat?" "Not for the public, that would be scattershot and inefficient. No, Archie, I believe this was used in one of 2 ways. Either to prepare a specific dose for a specific individual, or to eliminate evidence. In either case, the presence of this substance in a sealed batch container is damning. It means the cold room was being used for storage," I said. "Medical storage, hidden, dangerous." Wolfe nodded. "You see now why Miska's paranoia may have been justified." I paced the room, thinking out loud. The ledger had payments marked S.J. Private, but no such vendor exists. Morrissey couldn't trace it. What if S.J. was paying for use of the cold room? Not for meat, but for this? "Possibly," Wolfe said. "But let us take a step further. Suppose Eric Miska agreed to store something for a third party, perhaps under duress, perhaps for money. Suppose he later tried to withdraw from the arrangement and got killed for it. Wolfe lifted a hand. Not overtly, he died of heart failure. But there are more subtle pressures than poison or violence. Stress, isolation, threats. The man may have been cornered by someone who used his shop as a front. I sat down. And now the sabotage is about destroying the evidence and silencing his nephew before he finds it. Just so. I tapped my pen against my notebook. You want me to push the next two suspects? I want you to observe Jane Morrissey again. Discreetly. Watch who she meets. And then pay a second visit to. Rojas, mention the sedative, lightly, then observe. And Trento? Later, he is less likely to flinch under pressure. Wolfe stood, walked slowly to the globe in the corner and poured himself 2 fingers of brandy. He turned back to me, glass in hand, and narrowed his eyes. This case, Archie, is not about meat. It's about leverage. I gave him a slow nod. You think Rojas or Morrissey or both used Eric's facility for a side business? I do. And I suspect that business was neither legal nor safe. And now that the uncle's gone, I said, they need the nephew scared, silenced, or discredited before he connects the dots. Exactly, Wolfe said. You will find the thread, Archie. Tug carefully. We are very near the center. I looked again at the tiny vial resting in its evidence pouch. So far, the sausages had been talking, and the next conversation promised to be deadly. The next morning I made a point of dressing like a man who wanted to blend in, a grey sport coat, nondescript tie, and shoes polished just enough to pass for office casual. Wolfe had given me my marching orders the night before, and I didn't need reminding. My first stop was Jane Morrissey's office, and this time I wasn't there to ask questions. I was there to watch. Fortunately, the building across from hers had a bakery on the ground floor with a perfect line of sight to her window. I planted myself at a corner table with a cup of black coffee and a blueberry scone I didn't intend to eat. Morrissey's office faced the street, 2nd floor, blinds half drawn. I had a decent angle and a full thermos of patience. At 9:18, she arrived, brisk and efficient as ever. At 9:42, a man I didn't recognize walked in. Medium build, grey hair, light blue windbreaker. He didn't sign in at the front desk. He also didn't stay long, 10 minutes, tops. When he came out, he looked around before heading west toward Broadway, walking with that fast, flat-footed pace that says, I don't want to be seen, but if I am, I want it to be over quick. I finished my coffee, dumped the scone, and followed. He was good, not great. He glanced over his shoulder twice but didn't spot me. He crossed 3 blocks, turned left into a narrow alley, and ducked into a service door marked Employees Only. Above it was a faded awning that read, Delmar, Cooperative Storage. I leaned on a fire hydrant and took stock. Delmar was one of those shared warehouse facilities where small businesses rent cold space for overflow goods, cheeses, wine, produce. It wasn't suspicious on its own, but it was a hell of a coincidence. If Morrissey's visitor was tied to food storage and Eric Miska had been storing contraband in his cold room, we might be looking at something bigger than just sabotage. I waited 10 minutes, long enough to jot down the plate number of the unmarked van parked nearby, then headed back to the brownstone to report. Wolfe listened without interrupting. When I finished, he closed his eyes and steepled his fingers. Morrissey's visitor, did he carry anything? Small duffel. Could have held paperwork or something heavier. You believe he delivered funds? Or instructions? Maybe both, I said. But the Delmar connection smells like logistics. Maybe Morrissey's involved in distribution. Maybe Miska's cold room was a link in the chain. Possibly, Wolfe murmured. We must press further. That's what I thought. So, I took the liberty of requesting a delivery log from Delmar's front desk, told them I was with the City Food Safety Board. They were helpful. Wolfe's brow lifted. Archie, you lied, I embellished. Mildly. I got a copy. There's no mention of Miska's meats in their recent records, but 3 shipments from La Riqueza arrived in the past month. Unlabeled crates marked for Culinary Reserve holdings. Culinary Reserve, Wolfe repeated slowly. A fictitious shell. That's my bet, and Rojas is hiding behind it. Wolfe rang for Fritz and told him to bring lunch, light, since our appetites were now secondary to sedatives in sausage. Then he ordered me to visit La Riqueza again, this time with instructions. Mention the vial, Wolfe said. Do not accuse, merely suggest. So at 3:00 p.m., I was back in the West Village. The gold leaf letters still shimmered on the window, and the place was humming with late lunches, nibbling imported olives, and pretending not to notice the price tags. Salvador Rojas stood behind the counter as before, slicing a coil of morcilla with the same smug precision. He gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Back again, he asked. Still not shopping? Nope. Still sniffing. Smell anything worth reporting? That depends. You ever use phenobarbital in your sausage? He froze. Only. For a second, but that was all I needed. His eyes flicked to the knife in his hand, then back to me. Slowly he set it down. That's a hell of an accusation. It's not an accusation, I said lightly. It's a question. See, someone found a vial of the stuff buried in pork at Miska's shop, not where customers could find it, tucked away, like it wasn't meant to be discovered. Maybe your client's uncle had a pharmacy habit. Maybe. Or maybe someone used Miska's cold room to store things they didn't want traced to them. Things like unregistered pharmaceuticals. Rojas folded his arms. You're on thin ice, Mr. Goodwin. I'm skating fine. The thing is that cold rooms saw a lot of action over the years. According to a note Eric left, your initials were on the do not forget list, along with a spice supplier and a lawyer. Makes me wonder. Eric was a bitter man, Rojas said. He held grudges and kept lists. Doesn't mean he wasn't crazy. But you're not crazy, are you, Mr. Rojas? You're smart. Smart. Enough to know that if anything ever happened to that cold room, someone might come asking questions. Someone like me. For the first time, Rojas looked less like a smug butcher, and more like a man trying to calculate the angle of exposure. I don't know what you think you're doing, he said, voice quiet now, but you're stirring ashes. Whatever Eric was into, he brought it on himself. That's a confession if I've ever heard one. It's a warning, he said. I didn't push it. I gave him a nod, tucked the card back in my jacket, and walked out. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was seated with a plate of cold tongue and mustard. I laid out the results. He listened, then spent a full minute in thought before rising, to retrieve a volume from the shelf behind his desk. A ledger entry, he said, opening the book. From Miska's copied records. Note this. CRH, AUG, OKI, DEC. Special handling, after hours. Culinary Reserve holdings. Indeed, and if I'm not mistaken, the DEC entry corresponds with the date of Anton's break-in. So someone was retrieving product, I said, or cleaning up loose ends, which now include Anton. Wolfe nodded once, slowly. Tomorrow, you will go to Morrissey's office again. Arrange a meeting under pretense of clarifying her old invoices. Bring up the vial, then observe. You think she'll crack? No, Wolfe said. But she may confirm what we suspect, that this was not a simple case of sabotage. This was an illicit partnership, and now that one leg of the triangle is dead, the others are scrambling to cover their tracks. Triangle, I repeated. Morrissey, Rojas, Trento. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Perhaps, or someone else behind them, but for now we pressure the edges. Tomorrow will be instructive. He turned his gaze to the window, where the last slant of light was fading across the orchids. This, Archie, he said, is no longer about reputation. It is about conspiracy. And the scent of meat is no longer the strongest odor in the case. He was right. There was something else in the air now. Fear. And it was getting stronger. The next morning I gave myself the full Archie Goodwin treatment. Shaved, polished, pressed, and caffeinated just enough to look efficient, but not suspicious. Wolfe had made it clear the game had shifted. We weren't just peeling back sausage casings anymore. We were slicing into something tougher, with layers that didn't want to be seen. Jane Morrissey was the next point of pressure, and I had my instructions. Mention the vial, mention the ledger, and mention none of it like it was an accusation. I arrived at her office at 10:45 a.m. and caught her mid-sip of something green in a mason jar. She looked up from her desk like she hadn't expected to see me again so soon, which was flattering, considering the part I play in making people nervous. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, wiping the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "Back so soon? Looking for more financial ghosts? Ghosts don't bother me. It's the skeletons I'm interested in." I smiled, but she didn't return it this time. "Do you have a question, or are you here to deliver metaphors?" I took a seat. "Let's talk about one of those mysterious entries in Miska's books. CRH, special handling. That ring any bells?" She paused, just long enough for me to know she was buying time. I assumed it was a supplier. He didn't always tell me what the codes meant. Sure, that's what I assumed too, until I found out that La Riqueza has been making quiet shipments under the name Culinary Reserve Holdings. Delivered to Del Mar Storage, same location visited yesterday by a man I saw leaving this office. Her face didn't change, but her body stiffened just slightly. She set the jar down and leaned back. "What exactly are you implying?" "Nothing. Yet, but it's odd that Rojas, your late client, and you all shared ties to this ghost company. And now there's a vial, found in Miska's cold room, hidden. It contained a sedative. Wolfe identified it as phenobarbital." She went still. "I've never handled drugs," she said too quickly. "That would be illegal." "I didn't say you did, but I think someone used your legal know-how to create a paper shield. Maybe. A shell company to mask logistics. You didn't have to store the product, just make sure no one could see where it came from." "You have no proof of that?" "Not yet," I admitted. "But I'm gathering it. And the way I see it, you've got a choice. When the mask comes off, and it always does, do you want to be sitting on the clean side of the table or the criminal one?" She looked at me, long and hard. Then she stood, walked to the window, and stared out for a moment before speaking. "I'll say this. Eric knew more than he let on. And he was afraid near the end. He didn't tell me everything, but he left hints. The payments, the odd clients. He said once everyone wants cold space, but not everyone wants it for food. I thought he was being dramatic. Maybe I was wrong." She turned back. "That's all I know." "That's not quite true," I said. "You also know who SJ is." She blinked. I smiled. "You flinched when I said it. You recognized it. You know who was paying those off-the-books fees." Her jaw tightened, and I thought she might kick me out. But instead she said, "Not over the phone. If I talk, I want immunity. Protection. You want Wolfe, not the police. I want someone who plays chess, not checkers. I left with more than I came in with. Not everything, but enough to know she was in deeper than she wanted to be, and not sure anymore where the floor was." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my report in silence, his lips pressed so tight they could have held soup. When I finished, he didn't speak immediately. He tapped the arm of his chair 3 times and then rang for Fritz. "Have Sol Panza report to me in an hour," he told Fritz. "I will need discreet background checks, specifically for any licenses, import permits, or pharmaceutical connections tied to CRH and to Ms. Morrissey." "Sol's already on call," I said. "I figured we'd need him." Wolfe nodded, faintly approving. "Good, and now we bait the hook." "Oh, tonight," Wolfe said. You will call a meeting. I blinked. A meeting? Yes. Here, invite Morrissey, Rojas and Trento. That's 3 sharks in 1 tank, you sure? They've circled long enough. Time to bleed the water. What's the pretext? You will tell them that Anton Miska intends to reopen the shop immediately, that the health board cleared him, that he has engaged Wolfe to recover damages, that we have already contacted the authorities. None of that's true. It will be, Wolfe said calmly, if we need it to be. Tonight at 7:30 and... You think they'll show? I think, Wolfe said, they won't be able not to. I made the calls that afternoon. Rojas was the hardest to pin down. He wanted to know who else was coming, what the agenda was, and whether legal representation would be present. I told him he could bring a lawyer, but I wouldn't advise it unless he wanted Wolfe to ignore him completely. Trento was less slippery. He agreed with a grumble and a fine "I'll be there," like he was doing us a personal favor. Morrissey? She said only, "I'll come, but you'd better know what you're doing." At 7:25 that night, the brownstone was quieter than a graveyard with good manners. Wolfe had dressed in a charcoal suit that meant business. Fritz had set out chilled water, not wine, and removed every orchid that might give the illusion of hospitality. Took the front room. At 7:28, Morrissey arrived, brisk and silent. At 7:31, Rojas walked in with a folded coat and an arched eyebrow. Trento came 2 minutes later, smelling faintly of clove and annoyance. Wolfe didn't rise to greet them. He simply gestured to the guest chairs and waited until they were all seated. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have invited you here because the death of Eric Miska was not an end, but a complication, one that must now be resolved. Preferably before someone else dies." Morrissey flinched. Rojas said nothing. Trento scowled. "I don't know what game this is," Rojas began. "It is not a game," Wolfe said. "It is a trap. One of you is tangled in it. Possibly more. But make no mistake, there is a central thread, and I intend to follow it." He turned his gaze to Morrissey. "You knew about the shell company." Her lips parted, but she didn't. "Deny it. You, Mr. Rojas, used it to deliver illicit product to discreet cold spaces. Mr. Trento supplied the materials. Possibly unknowingly, possibly not." Wolfe paused. "And when Mr. Miska refused to continue or threatened to expose you, he died." Trento rose. "Now wait, just a damn—" "Sit down," Wolfe said without raising his voice. "And Trento." "Did," Wolfe glanced at me. "Archie, the vial?" I retrieved it and placed it on the table. "Found in a pork container," I said. "Hidden beneath sealed meat. We tested it. Sedative. Illegal without a prescription, and a trace signature linked it to a batch shipped under culinary reserve holdings." Wolfe spoke again softly. "You may not have killed Eric Miska, but one of you or someone close to you used his facility to store something dangerous, and you have since tried to erase that trail. Badly." He leaned back. "This is your opportunity. One of you will speak, or I will." The silence that followed was long, tense, and just beginning to crack because Wolfe was right. We had set the trap, and someone was about to step into it. There's a particular flavor to silence in Wolfe's office when 3 guilty people are trying to calculate how guilty they look. It's not the kind of quiet that settles in. It hovers, waiting to snap. And that's exactly what it did when Jane Morrissey finally broke it. She didn't shout. She didn't gesture. She just exhaled, slow and quiet, like someone deciding whether to fall on a sword or wait to see who else trips first. "I never handled the drugs," she said, "but I knew what the company was doing. Not at first. I created the shell at Rojas's request. He said it was for moving high-end food products discreetly to specialty clients, private chefs, diplomats, the kind who don't want publicity. He looked at Rojas. He didn't flinch. Wolfe didn't either. Then I started seeing the inconsistencies, Morrissey continued. Payments that didn't match invoices, gaps in the ledger, deliveries made outside regular hours. When I confronted Eric, he told me I was in over my head, and that if I pushed I'd end up in trouble. Why not go to the authorities, I asked. Because by then I was already complicit, she said. Unwitting or not, my name was on every document, and Rojas, she turned toward him, made it clear that certain parties didn't appreciate oversight. Rojas gave her a slow, measured glance. Are you accusing me of something, Jane? Wolfe raised a hand, not to stop the accusation, but to reclaim the floor. You did not act, Miss Morrissey, he said, but you knew, and your silence helped conceal the operation. That is complicity, not innocence. He turned next to Trento, who was shifting in his seat like it had grown barbs. And you, Mr. Trento, did you knowingly supply restricted chemicals under falsified shipping orders? I shipped what was ordered, Trento growled. Salt, herbs, stabilizers. If something else was added along the way, I didn't authorize it. Yet your name appears repeatedly in the ledgers linked to CRH, Wolfe said. Special handling, odd volumes. You expect us to believe you never noticed anything? Curious I didn't ask questions, Trento muttered. Not my job. That too, Wolfe said, is complicity. He shifted his gaze to Rojas. And now we arrive at the spider in the center of the web. Rojas gave a small, cold smile. You're very good, Mr. Wolfe, but all you have is conjecture. So far I haven't heard a single chargeable offense. Wolfe didn't blink. You are correct. The direct evidence is thin, which is why I summoned you, not to accuse, but to observe. He turned to me. Archie. I reached down and opened the file folder I'd prepared. From it, I pulled 3 documents, each a photo, the vial, the cold room shelf where it was found, and the inventory tag for batch 11C, clearly bearing the label CRH, Special Storage. I laid them out on the desk for all 3 to see. Rojas kept his eyes locked on them a full 2 seconds longer than the others. Not long, but long enough. You said that label was forged, I said. But this photo was taken 2 days ago. After Anton changed the locks, no one but him and me have had access. Rojas leaned forward. Are you accusing me of planting it? I'm not accusing you of anything, I said. I'm showing you what's been found. Wolfe's doing the rest. And what he's doing, Wolfe said smoothly, is drawing attention. Public attention. My next call, if none of you cooperate, will be to the FDA and the Bureau of Narcotics. Enforcement. I imagine they'll have more resources and fewer manners than I. There was another silence, but this one didn't hover. It pressed down hard. Rojas broke it. All right, he said. Fine. Yes, I used Miska's shop, but it wasn't for narcotics. It was for a product I was experimenting with. Illegal. In some places, not others. A natural sedative, plant-based. I was trying to corner the market on gourmet meats infused with calming properties. That's your story? I asked. It's the truth. We were early in development. The storage was for test batches, nothing for sale. Morrissey structured the company to keep it off the books. Trento supplied the ingredients. Wolfe leaned forward ever so slightly. A plant-based sedative, delivered in vials, hidden in pork, not on the market, not regulated, not documented. Your alibi is in essence a confession with garnish. Rojas scowled. You can't prove it was mine. No, Wolfe said, but I can prove it was stored in a facility you used, that your alias paid for, that your partners, willing or not, now confirm existed. If you do not cooperate, I will deliver that proof to the authorities, along with everything else. Morrissey turned toward him, eyes sharp now. He's right, Salvador. This ends now. We're not going to prison so you can market gourmet sleeping sausage to billionaires. Trento nodded, grumbling. I'm done with this circus. Rojas stood. His eyes moved from Wolfe to me to the photos on the desk. Let me guess, he said. This was all a play. You knew I'd react. You didn't need a confession. You just needed the reaction. Wolfe tilted his head slightly. Precisely. Rojas gave a bitter little laugh. You are an infuriating man. And you, Wolfe said, are a careless one. Rojas didn't argue. He turned without another word and walked out. Trento and Morrissey followed, slower. Neither looked back. When the door closed, Wolfe let out a breath, long and deep. Archie, Saul will deliver his final report tonight. I expect confirmation. But we now have the pieces in place. You think Rojas will run? I think, Wolfe said, that he'll try to clean house. But he won't get far. Not with Anton's cooperation, Morrissey's capitulation, and the evidence we've gathered. What about Anton? I asked. He's still a target. He will stay here, for now. I'll inform him personally. Fritz will prepare the guest room, not the spare? No, the guest. That told me Wolfe had already decided Anton Miska was in the clear. For Wolfe, that was as close to a benediction as anyone got. I stood and looked down at the photograph still on the desk. Funny, I said. It started with a sausage. Wolfe nodded once, slowly, and ended with sedatives, deception, and an amateur chemist with entrepreneurial delusions. And you haven't even had dinner. Wolfe reached for the bell. Fritz, we will dine in 30 minutes. Something warm, with mustard. As I followed him out of the office, I couldn't help but glance at the empty chairs. 3 suspects, 3 stories, 1 truth. We had the pieces now. All that remained was Wolfe's final move, and I had a feeling it would be checkmate. Anton Miska arrived at the brownstone just before noon the next day, escorted by Saul Panzer, who'd been tailing him quietly, since our little soiree the night before. Saul was the type of man who could follow you across state lines without you ever realizing you'd picked up company. He gave me a small nod as they stepped through the door, and Anton, looking paler than a parsnip in January, followed me into the office where Wolfe was already seated and waiting. Wolfe gestured to the red chair without looking up from the file. In his lap, Mr. Miska, you will pardon the precaution of surveillance. After last night it was necessary. Anton nodded, swallowing. I understand. Good, Wolfe said. He closed the folder with a soft snap. Because we are at a juncture where understanding is the only thing that will keep you from danger. Anton glanced at me, then back to Wolfe. They're still coming after me, aren't they? Not exactly, I said, taking my usual chair. We caught them in a lie, or several. That helps. But Salvador Rojas has more resources than a sausage, Shop implies, and while he's bruised, he's not broken. Not yet. Wolfe interlaced his fingers. Mr. Rojas has for years operated a secondary enterprise, unauthorized, unregulated, and ultimately dangerous. He used your uncle's cold storage to conceal a product that, though perhaps not overtly criminal in its early stages, veered into illegality through deception, lack of oversight, and willful concealment. I knew something was off, Anton said, but I never... Wolfe raised a finger. No need to protest. You are not implicated. In fact, you may now be our most important witness. Witness to what, exactly? To the pattern, I said. You knew the shop, you saw the orders, you saw who came and went, and with what Saul's uncovered, we've got enough to press the case, if you're willing to testify. Anton took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. I'll do it. I don't want to live scared, and I won't let them use my uncle's name like that. Wolfe approved with the slightest incline of his head. Very well, then let us complete the picture. He opened the folder again and drew out a thin stack of papers, Saul's findings. Mr. Panzer confirmed what we suspected, Wolfe said. Culinary Reserve Holdings is a shell company registered under an alias traceable to Rojas's restaurant holdings. Its storage accounts at Del Mar are paid in cash, filtered through layered business fronts and used only at night. The deliveries match, by date and quantity, Entries in your uncle's secret ledger. Anton sat straighter. So the whole thing was real. Indeed, Wolfe said, and more than that, dangerous. The compound found in your cold room, identified by Fritz with Mr. Panzer's assistance, is not a simple sedative. It is a non-FDA approved compound derived from a South American plant with psychotropic properties. In small doses, it produces calm and mild euphoria. In larger doses, confusion and memory gaps. Anton stared at him. They were putting that in the sausage? Not directly, Wolfe said. It was being tested, on whom we cannot yet prove, but its mere presence in food storage space is a federal violation, and its concealment is obstruction. And Eric? Anton asked. Did they kill him? Wolfe's voice softened slightly. We cannot say for certain. He died of heart failure, but we now know he was under severe pressure, likely emotional, possibly physical. He may have attempted to cut off the arrangement, hence the ledger note, the warning, the rearranged spice rack. Someone sent him a message. That message may well have hastened his death. Anton stared at the floor. For a moment no one spoke. Wolfe cleared his throat. But now we are in possession of a strategy. Tonight Mr. Rojas has scheduled a private tasting for potential investors. He intends to unveil a new product line. Let me guess, I said. Sausage that helps you sleep. Precisely, and we, Mr. Goodwin, will be in attendance. I blinked. You're leaving the house. Don't be absurd, Wolfe scoffed. You will attend with Mr. Panzer and Mr. Miska if he agrees. Anton hesitated, then gave a slow nod. If it'll help stop him. I'm in. Wolfe handed me an envelope. Inside was a folded invitation, addressed not to me, but to a Mr. H.L. Green, culinary consultant. One of Wolfe's alter egos dusted off for just such an occasion. You'll go in as Green, Wolfe said, with Anton as your associate. Saul will observe from the perimeter. You'll record the event. If any substance is introduced or referenced, we'll have it. And when the time comes, you'll ask a single question. Is this product sourced through CRH? The reaction will suffice, unless he throws a sausage at me. In which case, Wolfe said dryly, be sure it's not spiked. That evening, dressed in a crisp grey suit and carrying a notebook monogrammed HLG, I accompanied Anton to a narrow warehouse loft on the far west side. The invitation had gotten us past a clipboard-toting woman with designer glasses and a suspicious smile. Inside it smelled like smoke, rosemary, and money. There were perhaps 15 guests, slick-haired investors, food bloggers, and a few men with the hard stares of corporate attorneys. In the center of the room, Rojas stood behind a butcher block, slicing coins of a sausage so delicately spiced it smelled more like perfume than pork. He greeted guests, offered samples, and delivered small speeches about restorative meats and culinary serenity. Anton kept close, hands in his pockets, trying to blend in. Saul was across the street in a parked car, earpiece in, ready to alert Wolfe or the cops if things got dicey. When Rojas finally turned toward me, his smile faltered, just briefly. "Mr. Green," he said. "A pleasure." I nodded. Fascinating. Aroma, lavender, and a hint of valerian root, a calming touch. I took the offered slice and pretended to sample it. "And the distribution? Local or through CRH?" He blinked. Just once. But it was enough. "I'm sorry," he said. "Did you say CRH?" I smiled. "Yes, I understand they specialize in specialty products, private storage, discreet shipping." His eyes darkened just for a flicker. "I'm not sure where you heard that." "From Miska's Meats," I said, just loudly enough for the nearest investor to glance over. Rojas's lips thinned. "I think this conversation's over," he said. "Actually," I said, stepping back, "it's just beginning." The door opened. Saul Panzer entered, followed by two plainclothes agents Wolfe had been saving like fine cognac. Their badges came out fast. Rojas didn't run. He just stood still, watching the room as though memorizing who had seen what. As they took him away, Anton let out a slow breath. "Is it done?" he asked me. "Almost," I said. "Wolfe gets the last word." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my report with closed eyes and folded hands. When I finished, he said nothing for a full minute. Then, "Send the full file to the district. Attorney in the morning. Include Morrissey's cooperation. She may still face sanctions, but her compliance warrants consideration." He stood and walked to the globe. "Fritz," he called, "dinner." Fritz appeared instantly. "Roast duck with cherry glaze." Wolfe turned to me. "Anton Miska may now reclaim his name. The ledger is closed. The sausages speak." "No longer," I nodded. "And the cold room?" Wolfe allowed himself the faintest smile. "Let it be scrubbed. Some truths are better buried, once justice has spoken." And that was that. Another case cracked not with violence or pursuit, but with logic, patience, and a very suspicious sausage. The following morning dawned cold and quiet, the way New York occasionally repents for being itself. There was a thin mist hanging in the street trees, and the paper boys were late, which Wolfe noticed immediately. Fritz's breakfast tray was precisely on time, but the Gazette had yet to arrive, and that disrupted the sacred morning rhythm enough to make Wolfe glower at the toast, like it had failed him personally. I'd barely settled into my coffee when the phone rang. I answered in my usual dulcet tones, and after a brief exchange, handed the receiver over to Wolfe with a smirk. "It's the district attorney's office," I said. "They're calling with gratitude. Don't let it go to your head." Wolfe accepted the phone with a grunt. "Yes?" He listened, eyes closed, lips pursed. He gave precisely one indeed to "yes, quite," and a final "that is satisfactory." Then he hung up, folded his hands over his stomach, and leaned back. "Well?" I prompted. "They have secured a search warrant for the storage. Facilities under CRH's name. Rojas's product samples tested positive for controlled compounds, and Morrissey's testimony has been deemed credible enough to negotiate a plea in exchange for further cooperation." "Which means?" "Which means," Wolfe said, "the operation is dismantled. The substance will be traced to its point of origin, the shell companies dissolved, and the matter of Eric Miska's death appended with an asterisk, contributing stress leading to cardiac failure." I nodded. "Justice, Wolfe style." Wolfe's gaze drifted toward the orchids. "I do not favor righteousness, Archie. I favor order." That sounded about right, and it lined up with the new tone in the house. The case wasn't just closed, it was cleaned, sanitized, put back on the shelf with the label facing outward. But that didn't mean we were done. At around 11, Anton Miska returned to the brownstone. This time, he looked like a man who had slept. He even brought a box of pastries, which Fritz accepted with the solemnity of a court usher receiving evidence. Wolfe didn't rise to greet him. Naturally. "I wanted to thank you," Anton said as he sat. "Both of you." "Unnecessary," Wolfe murmured. "Your uncle, despite his eccentricities, was not a fool. He knew something would outlive him. You honored that instinct." Anton looked down at his hands. "I was angry with him, for being secretive, for not trusting me." "Fear breeds secrecy," Wolfe said, "often at the expense of those closest." Anton nodded, then looked at me. "So what happens now?" "You testify if needed," I said. "Keep your nose clean. Don't rent out your cold room to charming strangers with medical side hustles, and if someone tries to deliver anything in vials, call me first." Wolfe sighed. "Mr. Goodwin, must you always convert serious reflection into sarcasm?" "It's how I keep my arteries open." Wolfe ignored me and turned back to Anton. "You may return to your shop once the health department issues a new certificate. I suggest you rebrand slightly. A modest name change. It will distinguish your operation from your uncle's shadow. Anton nodded. I've been thinking about that. Something simpler. Miska and son. Even if the son is more metaphor than fact. A sound instinct, Wolfe said. Anton stood. You've both done more than I could have asked. If you ever want sausage, real sausage, you've got a lifetime tab. Wolfe shuddered. Let us not ruin a morning by speaking of pork. When he'd gone, Wolfe turned to me with a look that meant the conversation was over, but that I'd better hang around anyway. I poured a second cup of coffee and said, You know, I keep thinking about that spice rack. The one that got rearranged during the break-in. You think that was meant to confuse Miska or send a message? Wolfe considered. Symbolic, I believe. A calculated disruption. The equivalent of moving furniture in one's home, a violation of intimacy, meant to unsettle. Worked. Yes, and it gave him the final nudge to reach out. I set the cup down. I still don't get why Rojas didn't just cut ties and vanish. He'd already hidden the operation pretty well. Because, Wolfe said, arrogance is as addictive as any narcotic. He believed himself untouchable. Even when cornered, he hoped to buy time. But time is a commodity he failed to launder. I grinned. Nice one. Wolfe grunted. Fritz. From the kitchen, Fritz called back. Luncheon in 10 minutes. The brownstone returned to its usual rhythm, which is to say, perfectly still, except for me. But the case had left a mark. It wasn't often we dealt with something that didn't involve murder, but still managed to throb with tension, betrayal, and the kind of danger that didn't need a gun to feel fatal. Just before lunch, I checked the front hall for mail and found an envelope addressed in a looping hand. Inside was a thank you note from Jane Morrissey. Handwritten, no signature, just initials and a sentence that caught my eye. Even shadows are cast by something solid. Thank you for illuminating this one. I brought it into the office and dropped it on Wolfe's desk. He read it, said nothing. Then quietly, She'll land on her feet, or affirm, yes. Lunch was roast chicken with lemon risotto. Wolfe was pleased with the texture, which meant he chewed in silence, a blessing I didn't disturb. After, we returned to the office, where he resumed reading a monograph on soil composition, and I resumed pretending to organize files. It was a quiet day. No new clients, no sausage scandals, no chemical conspiracies, just a city outside, ticking, forward, and a brownstone inside returning to equilibrium. Wolfe didn't speak again until mid-afternoon. Then, without looking up, he said, Archie, remind me to call Mr. Hewitt about the orchid hybrid. I believe the bloom is ready. Will do. And order more typewriter ribbons. You planning to type something? No, he said, but I dislike being unprepared, which, when you think about it, had been the theme of the week. By 5 o'clock, the day had folded itself up like a napkin, neat and clean. The desk was clear. The case was closed. The world was once again safe from seductive sausage, for now. And Wolfe, having defeated crime without leaving his chair, leaned back, sighed deeply, and reached for a book on Roman history. Some men wage war with swords. Wolfe preferred syllables and silence, and eventually dinner. At 6 o'clock sharp that evening, the brownstone settled into the calm it knew best. Measured footsteps overhead. From Fritz in the kitchen, the faint scrape of silverware being polished, and Nero Wolfe ensconced in his chair with a book thick enough to double as a doorstop. The house was peaceful again, not because the world outside had calmed down, but because Wolfe had bent it, through sheer logic and stubbornness, back into order. I was in the office finishing my report. It's a habit I've kept, even when Wolfe doesn't ask for it. There's something satisfying about capturing a case in black and white after it's been wrestled into submission, documenting who lied, who cracked, and who walked away with, their dignity mostly intact. I just typed the final line. Subject declined to press charges, but the evidence was forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Case considered resolved as of 4:47 p.m., per Mr. Wolfe. When Wolfe spoke without, lifting his eyes from the page, "You omitted the psychological." I didn't even glance up. "Not my department. I leave the brooding moral conclusions to you." You want a line about the fragile complexities of human duplicity? I'll work one in. Something about sausages as symbols of modern vice, that would be trite. Then I'll go with criminals should stick to embezzlement. The meat business is too messy. Marginally better. He closed the book with a soft thud and looked at me. "There is something distinctly American," he said, "about conflating innovation with exemption from law." Rojas believed that his product, because it was new, existed in a moral vacuum, that its utility excused its illegality. That is not entrepreneurship. It is cowardice clothed in jargon. "You're on a roll," Wolfe sniffed. Morrissey at least understood her complicity. Trento lacked the wit to realize his, but Rojas, he believed himself brilliant, untouchable. That makes him dangerous. "He's in custody now." "Temporarily," Wolfe said, "but such men always resurface in another form, another trade." "You want me to keep tabs on him?" "No," Wolfe said, folding his hands. "Let the city absorb him. But remember his type, Archie. You will see it again." I nodded. "File that under men who try too hard to reinvent sausage." Wolfe grunted, which under generous interpretation meant agreement. The bell rang for dinner. Fritz was never late, and he didn't ring lightly. I stood and stretched. "Tonight's menu?" I asked. "Boiled beef with mustard," Wolfe said without emotion. Fritz felt it appropriate. I raised an eyebrow. "Symbolic much?" "It was not my suggestion," Wolfe muttered. In the dining room the silver gleamed. The beef was tender, the mustard sharp, and the bread precisely sliced. Wolfe said nothing for the first 10 minutes, and I followed his lead. Not out of reverence, mind you. I just respect the sanctity of food. Especially when the case we'd just closed had spent most of its time crawling through kitchens and chilling in backroom refrigerators. Halfway through the meal, Wolfe set down his fork and reached for his wine. "I dislike the phrase victimless crime," he said. "It is invariably used by someone hoping to avoid consequence, not by someone reflecting on harm." I took a sip of water. "You think Rojas harmed people?" "Of course. Indirectly, certainly. But he compromised the trust that governs food, Archie. Trust that what we eat is safe, is honest. His deception was not in the compound alone. It was in the pretense of offering nourishment. You do get philosophical when mustard's involved. I get accurate." He returned to his beef. After dinner, we returned to the office. I pulled the ledger from Morrissey's folder one last time. It still fascinated me, not just because of what it said, but because of what it hinted at. The way people tried to bury truth in codes, initials, and careful placement. "You ever wonder," I asked Wolfe, "how many more like it are out there? Ledgers in drawers, cold rooms hiding things besides meat?" "No need to wonder," Wolfe said. "There are thousands. Truth is not rare, Archie. It is simply not welcome." He looked at me, and his expression was not so much stern as certain. "That is why we exist." I nodded. "To dig it up?" "To extract it," Wolfe said. "Cleanly, without emotion, but not without judgment." I leaned back in my chair. The streetlights outside were casting a soft gold blur across the windows. Another day was done, another case closed, and for the moment all was still. Until the doorbell rang. I glanced at Wolfe, who did not move. "Expecting someone?" "Are we ever?" I went to the front door and opened it to reveal a slim man in his 40s, sharply dressed, holding a paper-wrapped package. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked. "That's me." This was sent over from Miska's Meats, personal delivery. I signed for it, took the package and thanked him. Back in the office, I unwrapped the paper. Inside was a single sausage, wrapped in butcher's wax, sealed with twine, and a note written in Anton Miska's hand, the first of the new batch. Clean, honest. You'll taste the difference. I handed the note to Wolfe, who sniffed the sausage like a man assessing more than just its ingredients. Well, he said, that remains to be seen. He set it aside like it was a book to be. Read later, will you try it? I asked. If Fritz prepares it, Wolfe said, perhaps in a few days. I smiled. You'll forgive sausage eventually. I forgive nothing, Wolfe said. But I make allowances for redemption. That was as close as he would come, to sentiment. And from him it meant the case was truly over, not just in facts but in memory. I sat down, opened the drawer, and filed the last folder under Miska Anton Cold Room Matter. Wolfe reached for another book, Outside the Street, hummed with the rhythm of the city that never bothers to rest. But here in the brownstone peace reigned again, until the next knock, until the next strange phone call, until someone's carefully arranged world came undone, by greed, by guilt, or by something as simple as a spice jar moved 2 inches to the left. We'd be ready. We always were. It was 3 days after the last visitor rang our doorbell, and 2 days after Wolfe finally allowed Fritz to slice and pan-sear the sausage Anton had sent, that the full weight of the case settled into place. It came not with a phone call or knock, but in the form of Wolfe himself, clearing his throat precisely once, his way of telling me he was ready to deliver a pronouncement. He was seated naturally in his chair behind the desk. I had just returned from delivering our compiled report to the DA's office, along with copies of Morrissey's ledgers, Saul's photo documentation, and my own field notes. The authorities were now waist-deep in CRH's dirty logistics trail, and Rojas was being arraigned that very afternoon. But this wasn't about legal closure. This was Wolfe's true end, his conclusion. Archie, he said with the formality of a priest beginning a homily, do you know what truly unraveled Mr. Rojas's scheme? The part where he kept his poison in a sausage tub, or where he thought a fake LLC could hide a sedative pipeline? No, Wolfe said, the spice rack. I blinked. You're serious? Of course I'm serious. It was the key signal. I sat forward. You think that was the first clue? The real first clue, Wolfe said. Consider. The only sign Eric Miska left before his death was a scrawled note and a rearranged spice rack. A man as obsessive as Miska, whose legacy was based on tradition and precision, does not allow his workspace to be disrupted unless he's sending a message. But the rack didn't say anything. Precisely, it was silence made visual. He couldn't speak openly, so he made chaos. In the one place it would be noticed by the one person who might understand. Anton. I nodded. Okay, so the spice rack was the trigger, but why not just leave a letter? Because he didn't trust paper, Wolfe said. How you saw the ledgers, coded, fragmentary. He lived in a world where trust was a liability, but he trusted the message would be seen. I folded my arms. So you're saying Eric knew he was being watched? Yes. And in those final weeks, he tried to warn his nephew subtly. He changed the locks. He pulled the ledger page. He disrupted the space. But he did not realize how close Rojas was to removing him entirely. His death was natural, yes, but under unnatural pressure. And that makes it culpable. Wolfe reached into the drawer and took out the note again, the one with the initials, SRDTJM. 3 people, he said, linked by one operation. None of them trusted each other. And when one link broke, Eric, they each tried to wrest control of the narrative. Trento through silence, Morrissey through legal detachment, Rojas through obfuscation. And all 3 failed. They did, Wolfe said, because they misunderstood the power of simplicity. A single spice rack, told more truth than their combined lies. That was Wolfe, all right, making meaning out of misplacement. He picked up the final page of the case file and signed it with a flourish. Then he leaned back and closed his eyes. "You were right, Archie," he said. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your instincts. About the break-in, about Rojas, about the shell company. You erred in tone occasionally, but not in substance." "Well," I said, "if that isn't the Wolfe equivalent of a standing ovation." "I will not repeat it," he warned. "Understood." He paused. "And what of Anton?" "Fritz says he's reopened the shop under the new name. Cleaned top to bottom. Health board approved it. He's got a waiting list already. Apparently honesty tastes better." "As it should," Wolfe said. I stood, stretching. "So that's it. We're back to orchids and omelets. Until the next fool knocks," Wolfe said. "Which they always do." Outside, the city kept humming. 1,000 stories pulsed through its blocks, some petty, some poisoned, some perfectly cured. But here, in the brownstone, order had returned. Wolfe had spoken. Justice had been reasoned into place. And, perhaps most miraculous of all, I'd gone nearly 3 full days without getting hit, shot at or insulted by a suspect with olive oil on his hands. As I filed the last of the paperwork, I allowed myself one small observation. "Say what?" "You will," I said to no one in particular. "But the next time someone shows up at our door with a sausage and a secret, I'm charging extra." From behind me, Wolfe grunted. "Double," he said.